This morning we looked at the subject of fellowship halls, whether these are things that are originated in the mind of God or added by men, and looked, for those who were not with us this morning, just focused on what Acts chapter 13, even looking at the church there in Antioch, as well as other passages, and the work that God has assigned to the church, and looking at whether the purpose and the funds that are dedicated toward a fellowship hall fit the work that God has given to the church. Tonight, I wanted to just look at some different questions or objections that people may have, whether someone is being defensive or whether they're just trying to understand some of the things that maybe you have heard over and over again that by nature of repetition are second nature to you. They are not heard and not thought about and not applied so consistently that they are very new and sometimes hard for people to understand. So from whatever reason the questions come, we want to be doing our best, especially because this subject applies many times to fellow Christians. And so we want to, in wisdom and have our speech seasoned with salt, but be able to help them to think about things maybe they haven't before. And in the process of learning, we've all gone through that process. Something we hadn't thought about before, something we had not heard before. And so often one of the first reactions or responses then will have a few questions about that to test the consistency, test that idea. We know truth will always be consistent and not contradict itself. And so when we rightly divide the word of truth, it can be tested. And so we want people we talk to respond to them in a way that shows we welcome questions. We're glad for them to ask, and we need to be asking those questions. Truth, as has been said many times, doesn't have anything to hide, is not afraid of questions. So this evening I want to look at to begin by looking at some common questions that will arise as this subject arises from time to time. The majority of these, if not all of these, I have heard personally, or maybe a few of them read from time to time. But one is that, well, how could you say that it's wrong for a church to have a fellowship hall and for everyone to eat together there? Because after all, churches often met in homes, and likely they would have eaten together in the home. And so how could it be wrong for us to eat together in a church, in a church-sponsored cafeteria? So what would you say? First of all, we could say, well, I agree with much of that. There would be true that churches met in homes, and it's certainly possible that after worship was over that they stayed in the same location and ate together. If they did, there's no objection to that. But the question would be, is there evidence that when they met in the homes, if they did eat a meal after that, well, who was hosting the meal? Who was planning the meal? Who was overseeing the meal? It would not have been the church. If the church was going to meet in someone's home, whose permission would the church need to have in order to meet in that home? The owners of the home. And so if the owners of that home wanted to invite everyone to stay, well, then they could do that. Or if they wanted to invite one family, well, hey, after everybody's left, y'all hang around and we'll have lunch. That's their prerogative to do that as well. So what happens in the home is a part of the oversight and the hosting of that home. So certainly the families and even individually, we should be using our homes in those ways. 1 Peter 4 verse 9 just tells us, be hospitable to one another. There's one of the simplest instructions in the New Testament as far as understanding it. Turn to Acts chapter 2 and verse 46. Even though the circumstance here doesn't match precisely the question, because the church was at least 3,000 in number, they were not meeting in any private home. It appears they were actually meeting in the courtyard at the temple. And so that's the first part of verse 46, continuing daily with one accord in the temple. But then notice, breaking bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. And so when that was done, who were the apostles saying, well, today we're going to eat at Willie's house, and then tomorrow we're going to be at Brandon's, and the next day at Jacob's, and so you're going to have, we're going to give you money and you're going to have the food ready. Well, the church wasn't overseeing the hospitality. Every family could provide, could offer and fund and oversee hospitality in the home. So there's no question a church can meet in the home, and then afterwards those people could stay if they desired to and eat in that home. But the point is, the church is not to be, on those occasions, was not planning, funding, or overseeing the meal on that occasion. And this line of argument that, well, since they worship there, then they could eat there, and therefore the church can oversee the same thing today. Who would want to say that the church should fund, oversee, and plan everything that happens in a home? What about things like 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 5, that a husband and wife ought not to deprive one another? That happened in the home. Does the church need to be funding and planning and overseeing those occasions? Don't think anybody wants that. Ephesians 4, verse 28, that we're to work with our hands what is good. Well, does the church need to fund and oversee and plan the work of the home? Well, no, that's the responsibility of the home. Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. Bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Does the church need to be funding fathers and overseeing fathers and in charge of everything that happens in a home? In fact, let's read Hebrews chapter 12. I'll just reference some of these passages. But if everything that happens in a home, the church is to be in charge of, none of us want this in the business meeting. Hebrews 12, 9 and 10. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them. Does the church need to oversee the correction and the punishment of children? That happens in a home, and it might have happened before and during and after the times that Christians were meeting in the homes of some families. Well, just because it happened in the home doesn't mean the church needs to oversee those kinds of activities. And then we read a few times this morning or referenced 1 Timothy chapter 5 in regards to the widows, where Paul gives some instruction, some of which the church is to be involved in, and some things that the church, he says specifically, is not to participate in, even in the care of some widows. That might be hard for, and that might even be good, because that passage is so plain and clear. On some occasion, to introduce to people around us, I don't know that people could even fathom that the Bible would say there are some widows the church should not provide for, at least in this case, on an ongoing basis. So this would not prove that the church could build and construct and oversee social occasions and casual meals. Second, from time to time, we are accused of overreacting and being overly protective of the building. And so they might say, well, the church's building is not a holy place. This is not a sanctuary. And so whether we eat here, whether the church funds meals, that's irrelevant. Well, again, part of this is true, that there is no sanctuary. We're not in the Lord's house. When David said, I was glad when they said, let us go to the house of the Lord, that was the temple. And God's dwelling place was literally or in part was represented in that place. So that was the house of the Lord. This is not the house of the Lord. We're not in a holy place. We don't have to take our shoes off when we come inside, at least for that reason. This is not a sanctuary. But so the building is not holy, that's true. But we are to be holy. And many passages refer to God's people as the temple of the Lord. So the church has to be holy. And so then in regards to this topic, is the church holy if the church uses their resources to spread the gospel? We looked at those passages this morning. There were prophets and teachers in the church at Antioch, Acts chapter 13. And so one reason that church was holy, those people were holy, is because they had prophets and teachers who were strengthening them, encouraging them, teaching them, as well as teaching the lost. That's part of what would make a church holy. But what if a church used their resources for other purposes? I gave a few examples this morning, but is it okay for a church to own a body of water? Well, really, the question is not yes or no. It's, well, what are they going to use it for? Could we have a pool of water so that when someone wants to be baptized, it's relatively quick and easy? Sure. Can the church own a pool of water to offer to the community as a community swimming pool or hot tub? Well, it's the same physical structures and elements, but two very different purposes. One is consistent with the work God has given the church. One is not consistent with the work that God has given the church. And if we swap the purpose, if we say, well, okay, this is going to be a baptistry, and then, well, on the days that we're not here, since the water's already heated, why don't we just open the door? And that would be a good relationship building thing to offer the community. We might reason that way, but that's not the purpose for which it was used, and that's not a purpose that's consistent with what God has taught the church to do. Would a church be holy if they offered their baptistry as a community hot tub? So the church must be holy in what they do and how they use their building and what they construct a building for. And that's all that we're trying to do. Another objection, well, originally churches didn't even own buildings, but we do. So the point there being, well, we're doing things that are not in the Bible anyway. So if just because a fellowship hall is not in the Bible, well, that's just one more thing to add to the list. You're already doing things that are not in the Bible, so what's wrong with doing another? This point is just trying to claim that there's an inconsistency, that you say you only do what's in the Bible, well, your building is not in the Bible, so don't criticize us if we're doing something that we cannot show is in the Scripture in practice or in principle. So, what about this claim? First of all, well, we don't know what church first actually owned their meeting place. We don't have a specific record of it, but we just don't have the details, even in the book of Acts, on the occasions where we are told, and those are few, where we are told where they were meeting. We're just not told the details all the time of who owned it or how they came to decide to meet in that place. Look at Acts chapter 20, verses 7 and 8. Acts chapter 20, verses 7 and 8. What we do know is, and I think everyone would agree, the church was meeting. They were meeting, and that was because God told them to meet. That wasn't just their own idea or their own tradition. The church was meeting because God told them to, but we just don't always know who owned the place that they met. In Acts chapter 20, verses 7 and 8, you remember this, in Troas, on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, so they had to have a common place to meet. Well, then Paul knew about that. He was ready to depart the next day, spoke to them, and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together. Now, I'm not saying they did own it. I'm just saying we don't know anything about this upper room. We don't know who owned it. In addition to the upper room, do you remember that there were lamps? They had lamps there in verse 8. There were many lamps in the upper room. Well, whose lamps were they? Would the church have had permission to buy some lamps, to own some lamps, if they were meeting in a place that they didn't own, or if they were meeting in a place that they did own? Could the church own lamps? Why would they own lamps? Well, because of the time in which they were gathering. And so it was already, remember Paul preached until midnight, and so it was dark there. So there's an explanation for the lamps that they had. So we don't own a building because the Bible doesn't say not to. That's not our purpose. We own a building because God told us to assemble, and God told us to worship when we assemble. And so that just requires a place. And God didn't say you've got to own it or you can't own it. God just said assemble. He was general. And so in regards to the details of who owns the piece of property where the saints meet, it's irrelevant to God. So we are just doing what God told us to do, to meet and to assemble. Now, did God tell us to meet and to eat? That is a routine meal. Did He tell the church? Did He tell all saints, you've got a responsibility to come together in one place and to eat one of your 3 meals of the day together in that same place? If He did, then the church would be completely justified in having a separate room or using the same room and having the lights or whatever tools or utensils you would need in order to do that. But if He didn't do that, then there's no authority for it. And I don't know the passage where God either commands it or even show that He gives that option for the church to oversee and to provide routine meals. I've been asked this before in the process of this discussion. Well, what if since you're saying there's some things an individual can do and those are different from what the church can do, well, could an individual pay for there to be a building, a separate building or a room, and the individual is going to pay for that? So then the church didn't pay for it, and everybody could still meet in that room. And again, somebody might be asking this, just trying to find a loophole. Somebody might be honestly trying to work through, well, how does all this work and apply? So let's be patient with questions. But let's just suppose that happened. Some individual pays for a separate little building in the parking lot here. But that doesn't answer the whole question, because if an individual pays for it, well, who owns it? And who oversees it? And who maintains it? Now, you've got a whole other series of questions that have to be answered. And if the answer is, well, as long as the individual paid for it, oversees it, maintains it, plans it, well, then the question is, why is it on the church's property? If He's going to do that, then build a room. And I've known Christians who have done that. Maybe they built a house and they've got plenty of land, and so they built like a metal building and they stored some stuff in there. But many times, what part of what was in their mind, we want to be able to have everyone over to the house. And so what would the purpose be for putting it on the property owned by the church? But if that's justified, then what about things like Romans 13, 3 and 4? We also read that and referenced that a few times this morning, that the civil authorities, they're God's minister to punish evildoers. Well, that's not the church's work. So could someone build a jailhouse on the church's property? Now, the government's going to pay for it, and the government's going to oversee it, and the government's going to fund it. But could they put it on the church's property? Well, again, the question goes back, what's the purpose of that? If the government's funding it and overseeing it, then what business is it to have it connected to the church's building? Why would someone donate something to the church that is unrelated to the church's work, and much less then to have something visible? This may involve just a matter of wisdom, but if it's something unrelated to the church's work, but it's there associated with where the church meets, that's the signal that sends to the community, is that we're involved in that. So that just doesn't send the right message, and it's not consistent with the oversight and the work of the individual. Another one, I've spent a lot of time talking with individuals, and from time to time this has come up. I say, well, what's the difference in a fellowship hall? Which, let's remember, that's just a label that for something that's really just a cafeteria or a dining room. But some will say, well, what's the difference in that? That after admitting, well, no, I can't find that in the Bible. But you know what else I can't find in the Bible is that coat rack back there. I can't read in the Bible they had a coat rack. And notice we've got a bathroom and a water fountain. And the suggestion is, well, you say we shouldn't have a place to eat. Well, you got a place to drink. You're just totally inconsistent. True, one's not in the Bible, but neither is the other. So again, this isn't really proving anything. Many times the point is just to say, well, you're inconsistent in saying that the practice of a fellowship hall is not justified. Well, first of all, let's just give a little bit of thought. Are these really consistent? Is a water fountain just like the fellowship hall? And my first question is, do we meet there for fellowship? Have you ever had someone, well, it's so good to have fellowship with you at the coat rack back here as you're hanging your coat up and they're hanging their coat up? I've never heard of that. Have we ever invited the community, hey, come to our water fountain and we're going to all drink water together and have some water fellowship? That's not the purpose of it. I've never heard it used that way, and if that was suggested, well, I would object to that. We understand that. Not the same. We have these things, but not for the purpose of fellowship. Do we use these things, the coat rack, the bathroom, the water fountain, to offer worship? Back to Acts chapter 20 and verse 8, for example, those lamps that were in the room. Do you think that they were having fellowship around the light? Well, let's each have a, like some wedding ceremonies, let's have a unity candle. So we're going to worship God by turning the lights on at the same time. They had lamps, but the light was not an expression of fellowship, was it? And it wasn't an expression of worship. So why did they have lamps in the upper room? I think almost the youngest here would even understand that. Is it possible to worship God in total darkness? Well, it's possible, but it'd be a lot more difficult to teach, to speak, to understand what the speaker is saying. We understand that. So it's the purpose of the lamp or the lights that we understand are just an aid. It's just something that assists us in doing what God told us to do. What God told us to do was to meet and to sing and to teach. And that usually means we've got to be able to see to some degree, to do it at all. And the better the lighting is, then to some degree, the easier it is to focus our mind and focus our attention on what we're doing. And we're not distracted by, well, I can't see the numbers up there because the lights are so dim. The same, think about the water fountain. There are many brethren that have really made a big deal about, well, you say we shouldn't have a fellowship hall, but you're inconsistent because you have a water fountain. I can't tell you how many times that has been written or claimed, but is it the same? Again, do we meet at the water fountain for fellowship? That's what they're saying they're doing in their dining hall. Do we offer worship with the water fountain? No. Is it an aid to worship? It is. That's why we have it. It can help with singing. It can help with some who are speaking. If there's heat, hot, that can be something that provides relief, that allows us to get through. And so that's the purpose. And things like that have to be the purpose. Something that simply aids us, that it has a direct connection to. We're meeting because God told us. We're meeting because God told us to meet. And so test the fellowship hall in the same way. Is eating together fellowship? Well, that's what they claim. But that's what sets it apart from the coat rack and the water fountain and other such things. We're not claiming those are for fellowship. They often claiming that they are. Does a fellowship hall provide an aid to our worship? And I've never heard the fellowship hall defended in that way. That, well, we're worshiping and this is just aiding and assisting us in worshiping God. The dining is the event. The dining is what often the invitation is based upon. Come eat with us and also come worship with us. But we don't ever say, hey, come turn the lights on with us. Come have a drink of water with us and then stay for worship. The way that it's presented and offered shows these two are not parallels. They are not the same. Check. Oh, I didn't plug it in. I think the battery's dead. It's okay. I think I shoveled too much snow today. Not firing on all cylinders. Well, one more question that I've heard before. And again, this is not really, because there's not really a biblical basis, or there are very few passages you could even stretch that would relate to a so-called fellowship hall. But often objections are made testing the consistency. And so sometimes the question's been asked, well, in years past, there was a practice that was common called dinner on the grounds. Have you heard of that before? And so the claim is, brethren, it would eat dinner on the grounds, and if that was not sinful, then what's the difference in that and then having a fellowship hall? So again, we want to be fair. What is the difference? Is the only difference, well, back then they tended to eat outside, and so now we're just eating inside. Well, I don't know of any division that happens because, well, we say it's okay to eat outside, but you're eating inside, and that's the problem. That's the difference. That's the division. That's not an issue. There is no difference whether you are eating under a covered facility or whether you are out in the open. But again, is that practice the same as what is practiced today? And first, we'd have to ask, why did they do that? Why do you think, if you're familiar with that, and this was at least 100, maybe 150 years ago, when brethren would have to travel far distances to be together, few, maybe no automobiles, so people are walking often miles to be able to meet together. Sometimes it's a family, if you can imagine, with all of your children in your family walking a mile or two. Sometimes coming even from farther distances, maybe riding horseback, maybe even in a wagon. And so you're traveling that far in order to meet. And so that was pretty common in our society for a time. So if you think through the logistics of that, after worship, the majority of people could not go home. By the time they got home, lunchtime is all over. It's maybe close to time for supper, or they're exhausted in the meantime in traveling. Much less could they go home and then come back and meet again that evening. I don't know how frequently that was happening. And so that practice was simply the result of the logistics of the limited nature of travel. They would travel a long distance to be together. And so after they dismissed, then people would bring their own food, and they would sit somewhere and eat together. And then maybe they would meet again, or maybe after they finished eating, they were refreshed. Then they were able to return safely to their homes. But the point is, the eating was incidental to the meeting. They were not inviting people to come eat together. It was just understood their purpose for meeting. It was understood what the purpose was, and just the logistics of the nature of travel and the time of travel practically necessitated that there be some meal before they returned to their home. Maybe the closest parallel would be when the children go outside and play after worship is over. What does that justify that the church plan, oversee, and fund? Is there anything sinful about children playing outside or even inside after we worship? No. Well, does that then prove? Well, then we can build facilities for that. We could build a playground or a gymnasium. Well, no, they're playing together is just incidental. It's a minor afterthought to the purpose of us meeting. We're not meeting so they can play together. We're meeting because God told us to. And then in the meantime, as we're here after we dismiss, that's just something incidental to that. The church is not planning and funding and overseeing those occasions. And so likewise, when they had dinner on the grounds, number one, did they call that fellowship? And again, we're having to do a little bit of projecting into the past. I have my doubts that they did. Did they buy extra land and say, well, there's our fellowship yard, and so we're going to go inside and meet, and then we're going to go out there and have fellowship? I doubt that was ever the case. More importantly, was the church planning those meals? Was the church funding those meals? Was the church overseeing those meals? Was the church advertising those meals? No, that was just incidental to what they were doing. The primary purpose is they were coming together to worship. So I'm not a historian, but as far as I can tell, these two are not compatible or comparable of the modern practice and this practice of the past. And most importantly, it doesn't prove anything. Whether what they did was right or wrong, that has to be justified on its own. And then the modern practice of the so-called fellowship hall has to stand or fall on its own. But my guess is if you could take those brethren in a time machine and bring them to today and show them what is being done, they would say, oh no, that fellowship hall, that's not what we were doing. That's not anything like what we were doing. And we would not do that. We might just still pack our sandwich in our van, but we wouldn't ask the church to build facilities, much less to oversee those occasions. So this is important. The controversy is not about eating outside versus eating inside. The problem is, the controversy is, churches who plan, fund, and oversee routine meals are practicing things that are not within the limitations that God has revealed for the church. They ignore the work God has given. They ignore the difference between the church and the individual. And I referenced this morning a lesson that's on our website that goes into more detail in that area. So these are 6 questions that I've heard, and maybe I'm sure you've heard some others. Maybe you have had in the past or still have some questions. And that's a part of this lesson as well, to show we're not afraid of questions. Truth doesn't have anything to hide in those regards. Last, that don't have this on the charts, but I want to just go through a few points very briefly to remind us of some of our responsibilities. The reality is this is a difference between us and even other congregations in this area and in this state. And so because there is a separation between Christians in this state on this topic, we need to think about ourselves. Turn to Colossians chapter 4. How do we handle controversy? How do we deal with others from whom we're divided over some issue? Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 says, "Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." Now here he specifically mentions those who are outside. And I'm taking the things he says here and applying them to often the way we have to walk and speak toward those who are inside, those who are actually Christians, but departing in some way. So first of all, just to remind us of the importance of humility. You remember the parable that Jesus spoke about the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the Pharisee saying, "Well, God, I thank you that I'm not like them. I'm not like I don't do the things that they do, and let me call to mind all the things I do that I ought to do. Thank you, God, that I'm like this and that I'm not like that." If we talk that way, what will that do if there could ever be any potential for study and teaching with brethren that we're separated from? Obviously, things that we say that do not reflect humility, that show pride or arrogance, are not going to help in that process. On the other side of that, humility is what keeps us learning. And humility is also what keeps us motivated to be willing to teach others. And so if we have that same heart, and we can meet others who would have that same heart from whom we're divided, humility will be a part of, doesn't answer everything, but humility will be a part of helping there to be some productive study of what God has said. Secondly, we might say this sometime, and even when we do, we probably mean something different, but especially for the sake of others on the other side of this question, it's wise to avoid saying that it's wrong to eat in the building. I say that because there are many brethren who have the fellowship halls, and they think that's the difference. They think that what's wrong is eating on the church's property, or eating inside the building where we worship. And so they say, well, that's why you're inconsistent. you say it's wrong to eat in the building, but y'all drink in the building. And that's really, as we've talked about, that's an oversimplification. But really, this is also an oversimplification to say, as an absolute, we shouldn't eat in the building. There are a variety of occasions where saints might eat in the same building where they worship, even if the church owns that building. It could be due to the length of an activity there. What if we were to arrange for there to be studies from 8 in the morning until 6 at night? Because of transportation, it might be easy for us to go somewhere else. But if we had a really tight schedule and a lot in that, then we might have a short break in between, and the church doesn't need to fund it, oversee it, or use that as the basis of inviting someone. But if the nature of the teaching of that day meant we needed to have a short break and eating in between that's not the issue. That is not the nature of building a dining room, calling that fellowship, overseeing that, calling that a ministry. That's something completely different. In fact, if churches ate in their building, but they kept it out of the church's funds, they kept it out of the church's planning, if it was incidental to what they were already doing, kind of like that ancient practice of eating on the grounds, and if they were warning against church-sponsored social meals and games, and they treated it as something as incidental as our conversations after worship. If they treated it just like that and warned against the typical practices today, well then I don't believe there would be division as there is today. And so, again, for just the sake of wisdom and helping others to understand what the issue is and what the issue is not, we want to understand and help them to understand. The issue is not eating under the roof or eating on the property. It's what is the church's funds being used for? What is the church overseeing and planning and providing? That's something completely different than eating in the building. Third, we're wise to avoid assumptions. The golden rule of Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12, whatever you'd have men to do to you, do also to them. And so my point here is when we meet brethren and they have this building on the side of their building, take the simplest approach and let them answer. Talk to them, ask questions in a very comfortable way, and let them tell what their practice is. Is that for classrooms, or is it for parties and for meals that they're calling fellowship? Let them give an answer without assumptions. And I think that would express to them humility. Also remember that there are many Christians, not only have they not heard a lesson on this topic, they've not heard a fair explanation of the difference. They've not heard a fair explanation of why even there is division. Further, especially as time goes on, the number of people who lived through some of the original division and controversy over that, the number of people who were alive at that time is shrinking on a daily basis. Very, very few. And so there are many people today that they don't even know that there is a difference. They don't even know that there is any controversy on the subject. And so, again, principles that we've looked at and that sometimes I haven't spent a lot of time on, like the difference in the church and the individual. Like when God says this, that eliminates anything else. There are Christians, there are brethren who hear very little, if they've ever heard any teaching on that subject. And so showing some humility and patience in that process on this subject will be important, will be essential, and will be helpful. Number 4, let's avoid, I should include that. Don't give up hope for brethren that we're separated from. That's one of the lessons of the golden lampstands of Revelation chapters 2 and 3, that out of those 7 churches, 5 of them, there were serious problems among them. And Jesus says the point would come when he would cut them off, when he would put out their lampstand. But Jesus didn't give up on them quickly. That's the reason that we have, one of the reasons that we have the book of Revelation. And so maybe John noticed that. Maybe the churches that read about themselves or that read about others noticed that here there are serious problems among us, and yet Jesus has not given hope of us being reconciled to Him. In 2 Timothy 4, verse 2, Paul tells Timothy, you preach the word in season and out of season, but also do it with all long suffering. Again, part of what can extend our patience with brethren is, again, the fact that many of them are totally oblivious that this controversy, that this difference even exists, and that there is even division. I dare say that in this town, in this area, there would be some who don't know that there is any difference between us and some of the other so-called churches of Christ in this area. And so let's not quickly give up on them, but from time to time, as we have opportunity, make some effort to try to know them, meet them, and at some point, may not always be the first conversation, but at some point, help them to have an opportunity at least to hear. And then last, of course, avoid compromise. We want to be patient, we want to be long-suffering, but we have to avoid compromise. We cannot pretend that, well, this difference exists, but really it just doesn't matter. Well, if it doesn't matter, then I've wasted our time in reading and studying and talking about these things. Turn to 2 Timothy 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 23 through 26. Part of growing in maturity is being willing to see the difference between things that matter and things that don't matter. 2 Timothy 2, 23 to 26 says, avoid foolish and ignorant disputes, knowing that they generate strife. And a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patient, in humility, correcting those who are in opposition, if God perhaps will grant them repentance, so that they may know the truth, and that they may come to their senses and escape the snare of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. So I'm confident that there are brethren who would hear me read verse 23 after this lesson, and they'd say, boy, he just read right over that. He was talking about disputes, and then he read a passage that said avoid disputes. But then the next few verses says, well, you've got to correct those who are in opposition. So part of not compromising not only means let's not build a cafeteria here, but it also means be able to recognize the difference between the things that matter and between the things that do not, that we do not correct those we don't participate in foolish disputes, but then that we do correct those who are in opposition to the truth, who have been snared, who have been taken captive, and those who are doing His will. And so I'll end by asking the question that I did this morning, the practice of a church-sponsored fellowship hall and social meal and parties. Is that something that originated with God, revealed by God, or is it something added by man? Let's be able to answer that question, practice consistent with it, and pray for, and do the best that we can to help brethren who have been deceived in that area. Take out your songbooks, turn to number 340. Let's sing with grace in our hearts to the Lord and to one another. If there is anyone here, as you examine your conscience, everybody else might think differently, but if in your conscience you know you're separated from God because of sin, then I trust you know He's provided the solution in mercy for you and in love for you. There's a day in which we're going to stand before God and give an answer. for what we've done in the past and in the present and with whatever life that God gives us. If there are any here who need to confess their faith and to be baptized into Christ, if there are any here who need to repent of sins, and our prayers will help and strengthen your love and your devotion to Him and to one another, if we can help you in these ways, tell us how as we stand and sing.